Hello, my name is Dana Hartline. I am the Mormon Trauma Mama. I focus on church trauma and healing. But today I'm going to be talking specifically about psychological trauma. Church trauma is an aspect of psychological trauma. But I am speaking today for an event called Survivor Speak, which is coming up in Salt Lake City. And they are going to be talking about the many hurting voices that need to be heard and understood. So I would like to address this very real issue of psychological trauma. And before I give you a formal definition, I would like us all to mentally try to take ourselves to a place to help us understand psychological trauma. So let's go to Aurora, Colorado. The date is July 20th, 2012. You are at the midnight showing of the movie Batman. Do you remember this night? This is the night the 24-year-old white man who had colored his hair Kool-Aid orange and red to look like the Joker in the movie Batman opened gunfire, killing 24 and wounding 58. I want you to imagine you are among that number. Imagine after having been shot, you had to go back into that theater every single week, sometimes more than once a week, with the gunman still there. Imagine that when you go into the theater, the people attending the theater oddly know nothing about the shootings that have occurred, and of course that you had been shot. To add to the complexity, imagine that it is an event that cannot be disclosed to anyone either. And because it cannot be disclosed, instead of receiving the much needed medical attention, everyone instead questions you and wonders about you. You want to share it with them, but you know it's not safe. One of the reasons it's not safe is the gunman is still there. He is there every time you go. Going back into that theater is so not desired, but you know you must go. You have to go for various reasons. If it's because of it happens in the location of school, you have to go for your education. You often have to go because it's required by law if you're underage and you're a child. If it is a location of work, you need the income, and so you have to go for your job. If it's church, you have to go for your family. You have to go because, ironically, the living water is said to be found within that building, and your heart burns for him, and so you go. If it is a home, you go because that's where you live, and there's no other place but within that resting area. You feel so ashamed, embarrassed, and confused that you were shot and multiple times, and that you are struggling because of it. You struggle with intense anxiety for fear that you will run into the gunman unexpectedly, although you are in constant outlook so that such will not happen. You struggle with intense anger because people, in their ignorance, won't back up, giving you psychological air because they have no understanding of what you have undergone. You struggle with intense self-hatred because you fear and even believe that you deserved to be shot. Now compare that to the location in which psychological trauma has occurred. And now I will give you the formal definition of psychological trauma. Psychological trauma is the unique individual experience of an event or enduring conditions in which the individual's ability to integrate his or her emotional experience is overwhelmed. Thus, a traumatic event or situation creates psychological trauma when it overwhelms the individual's ability to cope. The individual may feel emotionally, cognitively, and physically overwhelmed. The circumstances of the event commonly include abuse of power, betrayal of trust, entrapment, helplessness, pain, confusion, and loss. This definition intentionally does not allow us to determine what is traumatic. It leaves that up to each survivor. This definition provides a guideline for our understanding of a survivor's experience of events and condition in his or her life. When we're talking about trauma, we need to understand that what is trauma to one may not be trauma to another. We're all on different planes and tolerance levels, and those vary from person to person and from time and situation, even among those same individuals. If you are going through a physical difficulty, for an example, and an intense emotional injury hits on top of that, you are more likely to experience trauma rather than offense, and if all else is going well in your life. We must not be rigid or simple-minded in our thinking and understanding of this. We cannot just think that someone is weaker or more problematic because something traumatizes one and not the other. Timing and situations matter. We also need to understand that what is trauma, that trauma, is not the same as offense. We hear so much about offense in the Utah culture. We've been taught well that we choose to be offended. But offense is not the only level of hurt. There's also trauma. And people do not choose to be traumatized. One does not choose to be robbed or assaulted or shot. And trauma must be treated differently than offense. Just like a slap must be treated differently than a deep oozing cut. And if there's any group of people that need more sensitivity and understanding, it is this group of people. But you see, I'm not just talking about obvious trauma that can readily be recognized and seen. In addition to obvious trauma, there's also invisible, psychological, spiritual trauma. All trauma is very difficult to deal with, to say the least. People are not the same again after such experiences and violations. And equally traumatizing is invisible trauma. And it can come in so many forms and in so many ways. It can happen at home. It can happen at school. It can happen at church. It can happen at work. It can happen anywhere. And it's very important that we understand that psychological trauma lines up pretty squarely with the DSM-5 requirements for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. The symptoms are real and durable, and they include depression, hypervigilance, anxiety, flashbacks, extreme reactions to memories of the trauma, avoidance, loss of memory, detachment, disinterest, insomnia, and a loss of self-confidence. Now, the tendency is for people to want to diminish any kind of trauma that isn't combat trauma. But let's be very clear here. In combat trauma, soldiers go in expecting a battle. They go in trained to see an enemy. And so when they come home, we expect that they're going to have trauma. And so we make allowances for them. And we get them immediate support and help. We back up for these people. But with psychological trauma, one is being more often than not, violated and betrayed by people who were thought and expected to be safe. A priesthood leader, a family member, a friend, a helper, a defender. But with psychological trauma, no one wants to admit it and accept it. Nothing seriously bad can happen at church, for example, right? And the wounds cannot be seen either. So those suffering because they can't see the wounds, they're often just as equally confused as those who don't get it either. The people who maybe want to deny the fact that they have anything wrong and it's just offense and to just get over it. And because no one gets it, the hurt and the blame is often thrown right back onto the traumatized, thus causing greater cognitive dissonance, such as fear and confusion. When trauma comes from the hands of those that we thought and expected to be safe and trustworthy, our whole neurological system is thrown into chaos. In fact, research shows that psychological trauma is more detrimental and longer lasting than combat trauma. And many of these people endure what is called mobbing. Let me define mobbing. Mobbing is hostile and unethical communication, which is directed in a systematic way by one or a few individuals. The individual who is being mobbed is pushed into a defenseless position and held there by means of continued mobbing activities. Mobbing activities that people may experience include, there's 6. The victim is silenced by those in charge and left with the inability to speak out of fear. Verbal threats or other verbal activities which become part of keeping a person from doing their work effectively. Ridicule, gossiping or rumors, being given patronizing or meaningless tasks, and being harassed in a threatening way. One article on PTSD states, One great trauma imposer seems to be when it comes from authoritarian figureheads. Perhaps the hardship of this type of trauma comes from what Sigmund Freud observed as a common illusion of a father surrogate that loves all of the individuals in the group equally. To add to the conflict, members of such groups believing the surrogate father illusion will often call into question the trustworthiness of the trauma victim, and in support of the authority figure often diminishes the reports of the traumatized, leaving them without a sense of their own personal worth and identity. Psychological trauma is a very serious matter that we need to look at. Sadly, too often, trauma violates prior explanations and meanings for life. Thus, if victims are not careful, it can be a great destroyer of dreams, of religious faith, and of spiritual practice. In addition, traumatic reminders of actual events may occur by just attending the location where the trauma happened or seeing people associated with that trauma, which echo that, and that will cause re-traumatization. Thus, such violations generate intense emotional and spiritual distress, not only for victims and their families, but also can cause great harm for anyone associated with that organization. We need to have ears to hear these strugglers. If we really care about hands that hang down and about the well-being of our society, let us hear these voices who so desperately need our attention, sensitivity, and help. Thank you.